Picture the most feared soldiers in the world, men who overthrew sultans the way ordinary people change clothes, men who had toppled 7 rulers in a single century, strangled princes in their beds, thrown emperors into dungeons, and dictated terms to the most powerful throne in the Islamic world. For 400 years, no Ottoman sultan dared move against them. The ones who tried ended up dead. Mahmud II decided he would be different. On the morning of June 15th, 1826, he loaded his artillery, positioned his cannons around the Janissary barracks in Constantinople, raised the sacred banner of the Prophet Muhammad, and waited. When the Janissaries mutinied exactly as he had planned, exactly as he had predicted, he gave the order to open fire. By nightfall, the barracks were ash. Thousands of men were dead in the streets, and the most powerful military institution in Ottoman history, 5 centuries old, was gone. Not weakened, not reformed. Gone. This is the story of how one sultan spent 18 years setting a trap, and the day he finally sprung it. The Janissaries began as something extraordinary. In the late 14th century, Ottoman sultans created an army unlike anything else in the medieval world. Soldiers taken as children, raised by the state, trained from boyhood in nothing but war and loyalty. They were recruited through a system called devshirme, Christian boys from the Balkans, Greece, Serbia, Albania, Hungary, plucked from their villages at ages 8 to 12, converted to Islam, given new names, new identities, new purpose. They had no families to return to, no lands to protect, no loyalties except to the sultan who owned them. The idea was genius, an army with no divided allegiances, no local lords to answer to, nothing but the empire. It worked. God, it worked. The Janissaries were at Ankara in 1402, at Constantinople in 1453, at Belgrade in 1521, at Rhodes, at Mohacs, at the gates of Vienna. They were the empire's fist, the shock troops who broke every line they faced, the infantry that European commanders spent decades trying to replicate and never quite managed. At their peak, they were the finest soldiers on earth. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. The devshirme system started breaking down in the 17th century. Sons of Janissaries began demanding entry into the corps. Muslim-born Turks, who had never seen a battlefield, bought their way in. By 1808, the corps officially numbered around 140,000 men. The actual fighters, men who trained seriously, who could be sent to war and trusted to hold a line, numbered perhaps 10 or 15,000. The rest were urban men who held Janissary status, the way you might hold a union card. It came with pay, exemption from taxes, and immunity from most laws. They had no intention of dying in distant wars for a sultan they increasingly viewed as an employee rather than a master. The problem was not just numbers. The Janissaries had evolved from a military corps into something closer to a permanent interest group with weapons. They held shops in the bazaars. They ran protection rackets. They married, raised families, built lives inside Constantinople, while still drawing military salaries and maintaining the legal privileges of soldiers. The gap between what they were supposed to be, a professional standing army, and what they had actually become was vast, obvious, and apparently impossible to close. Constantinople's residents had a more vivid understanding of the Janissaries' decline. The corps had taken over the city's fire brigade. When buildings caught fire, and in a city of wooden structures fires were constant, the Janissaries would arrive, assess the situation, and name their price for putting the blaze out. Too low an offer, and they would watch the building burn. In the year 1810 alone, Constantinople recorded over 2,000 such incidents. The city's supposed protectors had become its most sophisticated extortion ring. Merchants paid them to operate without harassment. Tradespeople paid them to avoid having their stalls destroyed. Neighborhoods that refused to cooperate found their local cafes burned down and their complaints ignored. The Janissaries existed inside the Ottoman legal system as soldiers, which meant civilian courts had no jurisdiction over them. If a Janissary assaulted someone, robbed a shop, murdered a creditor, the case went to military courts staffed by other Janissaries. The verdicts were predictable. They had also become kingmakers. Between 1600 and 1826, the Janissaries overthrew or murdered at least 7 sultans. The formula was always the same. They didn't like a policy or a tax or a reform. They overturned their cooking cauldrons in the barracks courtyard, the traditional signal of revolt, marched on the palace, and dictated terms. Sultans who refused to capitulate were deposed. Sultans who resisted too forcefully were strangled. The throne of the Ottoman Empire, the seat of a dynasty that had ruled for 5 centuries, had effectively become a prize the Janissaries awarded to whichever prince they found most convenient. The sultans who tried to push back invariably failed the same way. They moved against the Janissaries without enough preparation, without enough allies, without the religious establishment's support. The ulama, the Islamic scholarly class whose rulings legitimized or delegitimized political action, had repeatedly backed the Janissaries in their revolts, declaring reforms un-Islamic innovations. Any sultan who wanted to destroy the core would first need the clerics on his side. Without a fatwa supporting the action, it was not just politically dangerous. It was, in the eyes of Ottoman society, religiously forbidden. Mahmud II watched all of this from childhood. He learned the rules of survival early and hard. In 1808, Mahmud was 23 years old and had spent most of his life in the cafes, the gilded cage where Ottoman princes were kept to prevent them from plotting against the reigning sultan. He had watched his uncle Selim III attempt military reform. He had watched the Janissaries depose Selim in 1807 when those reforms threatened their privileges. He had watched Selim dragged from his apartments, imprisoned, and finally stabbed to death by assassins in July 1808 as loyalist forces battered at the palace gates trying to save him. Mahmud himself nearly died that same day. As rebel soldiers moved through the palace searching for princes to eliminate, a Georgian slave girl named Chevri reportedly saved his life by throwing handfuls of ash into the attackers' faces, blinding them long enough for Mahmud to hide. The story may be embellished, palace histories often are, but the underlying truth is not. Mahmud survived by luck and nerve, emerged from hiding to claim the throne, and began his reign with a very precise understanding of the world he had inherited. He also inherited a lesson. His predecessor had tried to reform the Janissaries too openly, too quickly, with too little preparation. Selim had recruited European officers to train a new army called the Nizam-i-Sedid, the New Order, dressed them in Western uniforms, taught them Western drill. The force had numbered around 23,000 by 1806 and performed reasonably well in minor engagements. But the Janissaries saw it as an existential threat. They revolt before Selim had assembled enough loyal troops to resist, and when the uprising came, the new army stood by helplessly while the old one stormed the palace. Mahmud filed this away with everything else he had observed. He would not move too fast. He would not show his hand. And above all, he would not build a new army and present it openly as a replacement for the old one, not until the Janissaries were already destroyed and could no longer object. For the first decade of his reign, he said almost nothing about military reform. He dealt with problems that were impossible to ignore. A war with Russia that ended badly in 1812, Serbian rebellions, the slow unraveling of Ottoman authority in the Balkans. He built alliances with the religious establishment, the ulama, whose support he would need before moving against an institution that cloaked itself in Islamic tradition. He presented every initiative in religious language, framing change not as Western imitation, but as the restoration of original Ottoman virtues. He cultivated relationships with Janissary officers who were dissatisfied with their own core, men who knew the institution was rotten and wanted change, but had nowhere to direct that impulse. He was patient in the way that only men who have nearly been killed learn to be patient, and quietly, carefully, he began building a parallel military force. By 1825, Mahmud had assembled roughly 12,000 artillerymen he trusted, trained by European instructors, equipped with modern cannon, positioned in key locations around Constantinople. These were not reformist soldiers in the ideological sense. They were loyalists, men whose careers and safety depended entirely on the Sultan, who had no connection to the Janissary corps and no sympathy for it. He also cultivated the Sipahi cavalry, an older institution than the Janissaries, with a long history of bitter rivalry with them. The Sipahi hated the Janissaries. They would be useful when the moment came. He was building a mousetrap. 18 years of patience, of watching, of absorbing humiliations and filing grievances away for later. The moment needed to be chosen exactly right. In May 1826, Mahmud moved. He announced a new military regulation. Janissary units would be required to provide recruits for a new European-style infantry corps called the Eşkinci Okçağı. The Janissaries would be incorporated into something modern, trained in modern methods, placed under modern discipline. On paper, it was a reform. In practice, it was an ultimatum carefully designed to produce exactly one response. The announcement was framed with surgical care. Mahmud described the new corps not as a Western import but as a restoration of ancient Ottoman military virtue. The language invoked the glorious campaigns of Suleiman the Magnificent, the golden era when Ottoman armies were undefeated. It was not a betrayal of tradition, the decree implied. It was a return to it. Every conservative objection was preemptively addressed in religious terms. The Grand Mufti had already issued his endorsement. The ulama stood publicly behind the Sultan. The senior Janissary commanders deliberated for weeks. On one level, they understood the danger. Mahmud was not Selim. This Sultan had been quietly preparing for years, and the political landscape had shifted. The religious establishment, which had backed the Janissaries in 1807, this time stood firmly with Mahmud. Public opinion in Constantinople, exhausted by decades of extortion and intimidation, was not sympathetic. The corps was more isolated than it had ever been, but they couldn't accept the terms. The Janissary identity was built entirely on separateness, their own barracks, their own hierarchy, their own customs, their own cauldrons. Integration into a European-style army meant the end of everything that made them the Janissaries. Even the officers who privately knew reform was necessary couldn't agree to their own dissolution. The institution would rather fight than disappear quietly. On the night of June 14, 1826, the cauldrons went over. The traditional signal of revolt, overturning the great cooking pots in the barracks courtyard, meant the corps was rising. Janissaries began assembling at the Et Maidana, the meat square, the open ground near their main barracks in Constantinople. Senior commanders sent word to the Sultan. The corps refused the reforms. Word spread through the city. Merchants shuttered shops. Families retreated indoors. The city had seen this before, many times, and knew what usually followed: chaos, demands, the Sultan capitulating or dying. The Janissaries' calculation was the same one they had made for a century. No Sultan had ever successfully resisted them. Selim had tried and died for it. They had numbers, they had organization, they had the weight of institutional momentum. They expected Mahmud to do what his predecessors had done: send negotiators, make promises, walk back the reforms, punish a few officers as scapegoats, and quietly drop the whole initiative. Mahmud had been waiting for this moment for 18 years. He sent men to the Topkapı Palace to retrieve the most sacred object in the Ottoman treasury, the Sancak-ı Sharif, the banner of the Prophet Muhammad. It was brought out only in moments of supreme crisis, when the empire needed to rally every true believer against an enemy. Its appearance in public was a statement. This conflict was not between the Sultan and his soldiers. It was between Islam and its enemies. Mahmud displayed the banner in the Sultan Ahmet Mosque and sent word through the city: any Muslim who gathered beneath the Prophet's banner to defend the empire against these rebels would be rewarded in this world and the next. Constantinople's residents, shopkeepers and craftsmen and merchants who had spent decades paying protection money to the Janissaries, began appearing at the mosque by the thousands. The counterforce was not just soldiers. It was the city itself, finally given permission to fight back. By midnight, Mahmud had more men willing to defend him than the Janissaries had in their barracks. The trap was fully closed. The artillery opened fire on the morning of June 15th. Mahmud's cannon crews had spent the night positioning their guns around the Janissary barracks at the Et Maidana. When the Janissaries refused to disperse and continued their rebellion, the order came. The barracks, massive wooden structures where thousands of men lived, trained, and had spent their entire adult lives, were set ablaze by artillery fire. Men burned inside. Men ran out and were cut down in the streets. The Sipahi cavalry, thrilled to finally have official sanction to destroy their ancient rivals, rode down those who fled. Citizens who had spent years paying extortion to these same soldiers joined in with an enthusiasm that suggested the hatred had run very deep indeed. Some Janissaries tried to take shelter in the great water cisterns of Constantinople. Roughly 100 fled into the cistern of Philoxenos near the barracks and found themselves trapped. The cistern flooded around them and most drowned. Others scattered into the city's labyrinthine neighborhoods, tried to disguise themselves as ordinary residents, discarded their distinctive felt caps, and tried to disappear. Some succeeded. Most were found. By nightfall, the battle for Constantinople was over. Thousands were dead in the streets and in the ash of the barracks. The official Ottoman count of killed in the immediate fighting was around 4,000. The actual number was almost certainly higher. Mahmud's chroniclers had reason to keep the official tally modest, but Mahmud was not finished. The day after the fighting, he issued an imperial decree abolishing the Janissary Corps entirely. Not suspended, not reformed, abolished. The word Janissary was prohibited. You could not speak it, write it, or reference the institution's existence in official documents. Their barracks outside Constantinople were demolished. Their regimental cauldrons, the symbol of Janissary identity for 5 centuries, were confiscated and destroyed. Their graveyards were torn up, the headstones smashed, the distinctive Janissary caps carved into the stones, ground to dust. The Bektashi Sufi order, the religious brotherhood that had served as the Corps' spiritual backbone for generations, was declared heretical, and its leaders executed or exiled. The scale of the erasure was deliberate. Mahmud did not want to defeat the Janissaries. He wanted to make it impossible to remember them as anything other than criminals and traitors. Every physical trace of their existence was to be removed. 5 centuries of history, official history at least, was being retroactively reclassified. The purge spread outward from Constantinople in the weeks and months that followed. Provincial Janissary garrisons across the empire received news of what had happened in the capital and faced impossible choices. Some surrendered immediately. Some tried to resist. Mahmud sent loyal forces to deal with them. By the end of 1826, the remaining captured Janissaries in the Balkans were executed in a fortress in Thessaloniki. Ottoman chroniclers called the structure the Blood Tower. It has been known since 1912, with magnificent irony, as the White Tower. Mahmud named the event the Vaka-i-Hayri, the Auspicious Incident, the Fortunate Event. He ordered his court chronicler to write the official account, which was published in 1828 under the title Foundation of Victory, and served as the only permitted version of events for decades. History, as always, was written by the survivors. The official chronicle portrayed the Janissaries as traitors to Islam and to the Ottoman state, rebels who had brought destruction on themselves through their own impiety and arrogance. The Sultan was cast as a defender of religion, a restorer of proper order, a man who had done what necessity demanded. Every copy produced was the same story. There was no official alternative. The reaction across the empire was complicated in ways that Mahmud's official history preferred to ignore. In Constantinople and much of Anatolia, there was genuine relief. The city's residents had watched their neighbors extorted, their fires left to burn, their protests crushed for generations. The destruction of the core was not mourned in the coffee houses of the capital. Street vendors sold celebratory sweets. Imams gave sermons praising the Sultan's courage. There is reasonable evidence that when loyalist forces moved against the Janissaries, many ordinary citizens joined in spontaneously, not out of love for Mahmud, but out of accumulated fury at the Janissaries themselves. In the Balkans, the response was darker. The Janissary Corps had been deeply embedded in the social fabric of Bosnia, Albania, and the Greek territories for centuries. Many Janissaries there were not despised extortionists, but local leaders, men whose families had worn the distinctive felt cap for generations and viewed it as an identity rather than just a military rank. In Bosnia particularly, entire towns had organized themselves around Janissary commanders. The abolition did not just remove a military institution, it removed the power structure communities had built their lives around. The rebellions that followed in Bosnia and Albania lasted years, and required sustained military campaigns to suppress. Mahmud's new army, barely formed, was tested immediately in conflicts far from Constantinople. Some of those campaigns went badly. The fragility of what he had built was exposed almost as quickly as he had built it. Russia moved immediately. The Ackerman Convention, signed in October 1826, forced Mahmud to accept humiliating territorial concessions. The Ottoman military was, in the immediate aftermath of destroying its primary land force, visibly weaker than it had been. Russia understood this and exploited it with cold precision. A new Russo-Turkish War broke out in 1828, and the empire fought it for the first time in centuries without Janissaries. The new army, the Asakir-i Mansuri-i Muhammadiyah, the victorious soldiers of Muhammad, performed adequately, but had been in existence for barely 2 years. It lost. Mahmud accepted more territorial losses. He had destroyed the old army before the new one was ready. The empire paid the price, and yet, the Greek War of Independence, which had been grinding on since 1821, offered a preview of what the Janissaries had become. Ottoman forces, including Janissary contingents, had been unable to suppress a rebellion of peasant farmers and merchants for 5 years. Mahmud had eventually been forced to call in Muhammad Ali of Egypt, technically a vassal, effectively an independent ruler, to do what his own army could not. The Egyptian forces nearly crushed the Greek rebellion before Britain, France, and Russia intervened at the Battle of Navarino in 1827, destroying the combined Ottoman-Egyptian fleet. The Janissaries were not just corrupt, they were militarily useless. The army that had stormed Constantinople in 1453 could not suppress a provincial rebellion in 1825. Mahmud's gamble was not that he was destroying something valuable. He was destroying something that had been quietly rotting for 100 years while wearing the costume of invincibility. The new army Mahmud built was trained by Prussian officers, equipped with modern weapons, organized along European lines. By the 1830s, it numbered close to 30,000 men. By the end of Mahmud's reign in 1839, it had grown further and begun to look like a functional modern military. The men wore European-style uniforms and the new fez, the round felt cap Mahmud adopted as a symbol of the reformed empire, deliberately replacing the old Janissary headgear. No longer the old empire dressed in medieval costume, something new, or at least trying to be. Mahmud reformed more than just the army. He reorganized the bureaucracy on European models, established a postal service, opened a medical school, sent students to Paris and London to study. He introduced compulsory primary education. He abolished the system of military land grants that had sustained the old cavalry class. He had portraits painted of himself in Western military dress, the first Ottoman Sultan to commission such images, and displayed them publicly, a visible declaration that the old rules no longer applied. The historian's instinct is to call Mahmud the Peter the Great of Turkey. His contemporaries made the same comparison. The parallel is real. Both men dragged their empires toward modernization through sheer brutal will. Both destroyed old institutions that had become obstacles. Both created new armies on Western models. Peter forced his nobles to shave their beards. Mahmud forced his officials to wear the fez, symbolic violence in service of actual change. But the comparison also shows the limits. Peter's Russia emerged from his reforms as the dominant power in Northern Europe. Mahmud's Ottoman Empire kept losing ground throughout his reign. Bessarabia to Russia in 1812, Serbian autonomy, Greek independence, more losses in 1829. The reforms were real. They were not sufficient. The empire was too large, too diverse, too far behind, and the world was moving too fast. What Mahmud built gave his successors something to work with. It did not reverse the fundamental trajectory. He died in 1839 of tuberculosis at 53 years old. He had been sick for years and knew it was coming. His son, Abdülmecid, 16 years old, inherited a modernizing empire still hemorrhaging territory on every frontier. The reforms Mahmud had begun continued under the Tanzimat, the great restructuring of the 1840s and beyond. But the empire never fully recovered the ground it lost in those years. The machine Mahmud had spent his reign building would keep running for another 80 years before it finally stopped in 1922. The Janissary graveyards were rebuilt eventually. The stones were restored, Constantinople changed its name to Istanbul. The White Tower in Thessaloniki became a tourist landmark, its real history forgotten by most of the visitors who photograph it against the Aegean light. Almost nothing visible remains of the core that once defined the empire. A handful of graves, some artifacts in museum display cases, the memory preserved in Ottoman chronicles, and European accounts that describe them with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. In Üsküdar, on the Asian shore of Istanbul, there is one Janissary gravestone that survived the purge. The distinctive carved cap that marks it a Janissary burial was not destroyed. Nobody knows why this one was spared when thousands of others were smashed. Perhaps an oversight. Perhaps a deliberate act of preservation by someone who thought the erasure had gone too far. Mahmud ordered the event called the Fortunate Incident. History kept the name but complicated the verdict. He destroyed an institution that had become a parasite on the state it was supposed to serve. He also destroyed the only professional military force his empire possessed, right when the empire most needed military strength. He did both of these things deliberately, with full awareness of the trade-offs, over 18 years of careful preparation. Whether the calculation was correct depends entirely on what you think the Ottoman Empire should have been trying to accomplish. What is not in dispute: the Sultan, who everyone before him was afraid to cross, decided he was done being afraid. He built his trap. He waited. He pulled the lever. The Janissaries marched into it exactly as he had planned, and by evening 4 centuries of accumulated power were burning in the streets of Constantinople. He named it the Fortunate Event. From where he stood in June 1826, watching the barracks burn and the banner of the Prophet flying over a city that had finally decided it was done with the old order, it probably felt like one.